So good morning, everyone. We are here today, November 22nd, for a dialogue with the authors with Neena Verma. And I'm welcoming you all from all over the world. So we are here together for about an hour to talk about Neena's book, Grief, Growth, Grace, A Sacred Pilgrimage. And just to get us started, I will say a few words about the Taos Institute. So I'm Alex Arnold, I'm the program director at the Taos Institute, and we're a nonprofit virtual educational organization. We promote social constructionist theory and practice across disciplines, education, organization change, therapy, so much more. So we really believe that it is in relational processes that we can create the world we want to live in. And so the Taos Institute offers courses, workshops, dialogue with the authors like this one. We have conferences. We just finished a wonderful virtual conference called The Gathering this past week, where about 300 people from 35 countries came together to listen to each other's practices and ideas. We have podcasts, videos, dissertation, lots of resources about appreciative and relational practices on our website, which is www.taosinstitute.net. So I invite you to visit our website. And we are a volunteer-based organization, so we appreciate any donation that you may feel inclined to make. You can do so on our website. And once again, I want to welcome you here for this hour of conversation together and welcome Neena Verma to talk about her book, Grief, Growth, and Grace, A Sacred Pilgrimage. So welcome, Neena.
Namaste, everyone. And many thanks, Alex, Dawn, and Taos Institute for this wonderful opportunity. I see some familiar faces. Sheila is there, and I see my son Pratyush also there, and I see so many of you whose names I have been reading in various Taos mailers. And last 1 week or so, Sevilla and Alex and myself, we've been in touch, and I so appreciate that you made time to come. Despite the fact that you have to go somewhere. So I am so appreciative for this opportunity and for this meeting today. How do you want me to start, Alex? Do you want me to talk about the book straight away, or do you want me to first say something about myself? I'm not too sure. How do you want me to go about?
I would love for you to introduce yourself, if a few words, and so we get to know you a little bit, and then introduce your book. Yes.
Thank you so much. So I am Neena, that all of you know. I live in New Delhi, India, and I'm born and brought up in the city and educated there at University of Delhi, and by the grace of God, a prize-winning alumni from University of Delhi. I've had a long career in organization change and development. Came across appreciative inquiry while doing my doctorate, and since then it's been almost 20 years that appreciative inquiry has been, in a way, I can say, my life. And it's not just work, it's not just methodology, it's been the philosophy, the way of life for me. Then somewhere along the line, while I was working as organization change and development expert and executive coach, systemic coach, I came across a case where I realized that by third or fourth session in that coaching assignment, I realized that the coachee was perhaps sitting on a huge pile of grief and trauma from his early childhood. He was in his mid-40s, and it seemed that he was carrying over 3 decades of pain, trauma, grief, which was all unrecognized, unaddressed. And it was manifesting in various ways in his behavior. And so when I realized this, I reported the matter to the organization and told them that I'm not qualified therapist. I'm not competent enough to work with this. And this was in the winter of 2007-8. I don't recall exactly when, but this was that winter. And a few weeks later, the organization came back to me and said that, 'he's feeling some kind of a comfort with you and he wants to continue with you.' And I was very nervous. I didn't know what to do because I was not a qualified therapist. Of course, I had background in applied behavioral science, in Jungian depth psychology, in logotherapy, in appreciative inquiry, positive psychology, everything. But grief was an alien area for me. Grief and trauma was something that I knew nothing about. And so I was very nervous. I didn't know what to do. And then I did what social constructionism teaches us. I just held a space where he could perhaps reconstruct his own being. You know, he allowed his all the pent up anguish, despair, grief, trauma that he had been sitting on, slowly and gradually, he started to allow a voice to that. And when that started to get an expression, he found a way to start reconstructing his whole being. So 6 months down the line, I was told that there were some changes that the organization felt, and they thought that the engagement could be closed. The gentleman continued another 6 months with me. And I think all that I did was some kind of appreciative inquiry work, some kind of social constructionism work with him. His relationship with himself, his relationship with his pain, his relationship with his trauma, his relationship with his grief, and his relationship with the sleeping potential within him for post-traumatic growth. So that's perhaps, those were the things which started to come out on the table. So this is how I think I forayed into grief and post-traumatic growth area, not by design, but by default, and but by circumstances or a chance of events that I was actually very nervous to take on, but I did. Soon some words spread and 3-4 more referrals happened, similar. I was tentative with all those cases. I was hesitant with all those cases, but nonetheless, I worked further and I took that on. And so by third or fourth cases, I had developed such keen and deep interest in that work that I made a promise to myself that the day I retire from my organization change and development and leadership work, I would make a permanent and deep shift to grief, trauma, and post-traumatic growth work. So that is the background with which I came into this work. Eventually, from 2011 onwards, I started to acquire some training in this area. But this was still a professional work for me. This was not really something that had yet gone into my veins or my heart or my soul. 2014, destiny tried me with a tragedy that should not happen with anybody. I lost my elder son, all of 22, on perhaps one of the happiest day of his life. Just like that, in a matter of seconds, we lost him to an undetected cardiac condition triggered cardiac arrest. We didn't get even minutes to do anything. So this was something that just kind of shattered me to the core. It literally tore open our family. They were at individual level as well as at the familial level. I think we were totally torn apart. So that was the time that I just could not continue with my work. I was advising for organization change and development, Samsung Electronics at that time, and a couple more organizations. So the work that I was doing, obviously, it took them some time to relieve me. They couldn't relieve me immediately. But I realized I was just not in a position to work. I needed to give myself time to sit with my grief, to allow myself to grieve. And in that time, I think all of us know about Dr. Ron Fry from Appreciative Inquiry Space. So he's my dear mentor. He just kept a tab on me, and he kept nudging me to come back to appreciative inquiry work, saying that this will help you, just find a calling in life and the purpose in life to continue. So I took his nudges, and 2 years later, I came back to work and did some appreciative inquiry work, but realized that I didn't have my heart and soul in it, and I just could not do any organizational consulting work. And that was my honest realization that I perhaps now needed to dedicate myself full time to grief and trauma work. And so 2016 onwards, my journey began. I got formally trained and certified, and I started to volunteer for underprivileged sections and the victims of socio-communal violence, the survivors as well as the bereaved. And of course, there was professional practice in grief and trauma space. So all this was happening, and I was slowly and gradually realizing that I was learning and my roots were deepening. But I could never see myself writing a book so early. I didn't know that I would write a book so early. It was just not in my configuration. It was just not in my thought process. 2019 was a blessed opportunity when I got inducted to TAOS as an associate. And with that, certain things, some more things started to happen alongside the same time. And the Appreciative Inquiry Practitioner General invited me to design and lead edit an issue on grief and growth theme, which was to release in May 2020. So that issue, when we were working on that issue, myself and my grief psychology mentor, Dr. Bob Niemeyer, who's also a TAOS associate, we both were working on that issue. Little did we realize that when it was to release in May 2020, the whole world would be already plunged into the widespread grief and trauma that all of us have had to face and live with in the last 2.5 years. So this issue became something which was found to be so timely and topical and relevant that more and more calls started to come to me, more and more nudges started to come to me. And that is what led me to write this book. So this is a little story about this book, how this book came into being. This came into being because I received so many nudges from so many people around the world for a book which talks of grief and growth in the same frame. Not as something which is grief to growth or growth after grief, but something that acknowledges that grief and growth can be existential co-pilgrims. So that is the thought with which I took this call to write this book. Also, because at least in India, I don't know much about other territories, though I do know some bit, but at least in India, there was not a single book on grief which was written in a conversational style, relatable style, that people could understand of it without professional jargonry, people could relate to it and people could make sense of it and make use of it. So that was another intention for this book, that make it relatable, make it usable, make it friendly for the reader and make it real for them. So for that, I went back to the constructivist approach. And I knew that unless I make the reader a partner in their reading journey, it won't work. So therefore, all the exercises designed in this book are designed in a way that each reader can consider the exercises to be something that they can own and they can take home and they can say that, yes, this belongs to me. And yes, this makes personal sense for me. So with all these intentions, this book came into being. My professional background, I think by now I have already shared a little bit. Organization change and development consultant and executive coach, systemic coach, shifted to grief, trauma, and resilience work. So So this is what I do. I coach and counsel, and I offer therapy, and I also educate and train in this space. With your consent, if you all like, I would like to just show you a little bit about the table of contents of this book, and then just speak a little about what forms the heart and mind of this book, the model which is at the heart and mind of this book, and then we can throw the forum open for an interactive conversation with all. Is it okay, Alex, if I show
That would be
few
wonderful,
slides?
yes.
Thank you. So is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So this is the I would say the table of, you can think of it as table of contents. What typically is in most books something called preface or introduction is what I have called invocation, and it is not without purpose that I call it invocation. The book starts with the greeting of namaste, which I guess most of you must be knowing that it is an Indian way of greeting. But I don't know how many of you know that namaste means the light in me honors the light in you. So the book invokes you to your own light, to your own wisdom. So that is the start of the book, and then the book is organized in three parts. First part, as you can see, the name is Maze of Grief. It has two chapters. The first chapter essentially underlines the fact that the only truth about life, perhaps, is the certainty of death. The only truest thing about life is perhaps its transience, its impermanence, and the various kinds of losses, death and non-death losses that can happen. Then the second chapter talks about the various forms and manifestations that grief takes, the various levels: physiological, mental, emotional, spiritual, relational, societal, various levels at which grief manifests, the various metaphors of grief. And second, these two chapters are essentially laying a foundation for what really grief is. So I have tried to keep it jargon free, but yet be able to give a conceptual orientation to the reader about what really grief is all about. Then second part, which is Mystique of Growth, is where I introduce my model called Growth Mandala. And in a little while from now, I'll just tell you why I used the word mandala. I guess many of you might be familiar with this word, but why have I used it in the context of post-traumatic growth? I will just share in a little while. Now, growth here is an acronym for 6 phases. Now, all these phases: grief, affirmation, resilient adaptation, opening to the emergent, way to well-being, transformation, and harmonious reemergence. These phases are they're all sovereign phases. They all stand on their own. They're not necessarily sequentially bound, though there is a certain reason and certain purpose why they have been organized like this. Of course, it is to give a certain coherent structure to the model, but also because why grief affirmation followed by resilient adaptation. There's a certain reasoning to it, but at the same time, I have seen in my practice that different grievers sometimes have different needs, and therefore they respond to different phases with less or more energy. In fact, I have seen that many grievers in normal bereavement cases do not even need any help for grief affirmation. They jump straight to resilient adaptation. Then they come to way to well-being. Most grievers, in fact, work in these two phases. But then there are some grievers who take the call for a deeper, I would say, calling and a greater growth, and they go to the phases of transformation and meaningful reemergence. Finally, the part 3, which is about grace. And when I say grace, I begin it with the idea of forgiveness. And what does the idea of forgiveness in the context of grief mean? Well, actually, The truth is that sometimes grief can, and it does, cause a lot of bitterness. There's a sense of betrayal sometimes by destiny. There's anger, but we don't know who to direct that anger at. We really don't know who we are angry with. So sometimes grief has a way of turning bitter and turning resentful and turning very angry. So forgiveness has a direct and important place in the realm of grief. So that's where I talk of forgiveness. This is a pretty long chapter. And then finally, the grace way. When I say grace way here, grace is also an acronym for 5 aspects of our life, which is existentially deeper and spiritually more wholesome. So this is the acronym is G for gratitude, R for reverence for life, A for affirmation, C for compassion, and E for essence of life. Essence here meaning of life. Eventually, the book ends with a prayer that I have composed, and that prayer kind of amalgamates. It's a confluence of all 3: grief, growth, and grace. So this is how the book is organized. And I'll take just 5 more minutes to quickly tell you a little about the 2 models which sit at the heart of the book. One is this model which has been briefly touched upon in the chapter 3. This is a sketch that I had just randomly doodled one day. And little did I know that it would go eventually. Sheila is here, she knows the story, that it would go on the cover page of the issue that I had lead edited with Bob Niemeyer for Appreciative Inquiry, the issue titled Grief and Growth. Now, the whole idea of this eternal spiral is that says that life remains in a cosmic loop where it is not neatly segmented away from each other. The loss and love are not neatly segmented away. Instead, they have a way to meet at the confluence called acceptance. Same goes for trauma and transformation and grief and growth. On each side of the loop, we have to experience, we have to undergo, we have to endure different phases. But then eventually, life has a way of merging and emerging and from the 2 loops, which become 1 loop. So therefore, grief and growth can form an eternal spiral. So that's the idea of this model. And the other model that I have held as the spine of the book in the part 2 is called GROWTH Mandala. Why I call it a mandala? Mandala, as many of you must be knowing, is a very commonly used term and phenomenon in Buddhism. Buddhism has made it popular. However, it has its origin in Sanskrit language. It goes back to Rig Veda, one of the most ancient Hindu scriptures. And basically, mandala is about, it has various meanings. One meaning is it's an eternal circle of life. And in Tibetan Buddhism especially, it is also meant to represent Buddha field. Now, when we talk of Buddha field is the field of both knowing, not knowledge, knowing, which is expansive, which is forever evolving, as well as ignorance. So Buddha field is a field of paradoxical co-occurrence of ignorance as well as enlightenment. Mandala it also represents the confluence of self, which is like you and I, our individual being, self with a small s. The samsara. Samsara is the Pali or Sanskrit word for the material world, the manifest world where we all live, where we all transact, where we all create and co-construct our relational structures. And the self with a capital S, which is the awakened self. the bodhi self. Bodhi word, again, a Sanskrit word which means awakened and knowing self, the deep knowing self, the essential knowing self. A mandala has many circles within it. Now, what I understand by those circles is that each circle is like a life journey within one life journey, several life journeys within one life journey. Mandala essentially has 3 rings. The outer ring is called the ring of fire. Now, this ring of fire is at the threshold of samsara, the manifest world, and the self, the individual self. The circumference of the outer circle where we step out of ourselves and we meet the world and we co-construct our reality in the context or in the larger realm of the world. That is the outer ring, the ring of fire. This is where the suffering is happening. This is where the joy is also happening. This is where we are co-constructing so many different human and relational experiences. Then comes the middle circle. The middle ring is called the ring of Vajra. Vajra is the word for thunderbolt. Now, this is the circle of the essential truth that we all hold within ourselves. Our own unique and personal truth that we create and construct within ourselves. Our own deep constructs, our personal power, our personal resilience. So that's the circle. When we enter that circle offers the invitation for us to construct our personal truth, our personal strength, our personal power. Then we go further deep into the innermost ring. That is called the ring of lotus. So I use lotus symbolism also in this book. Why? Because lotus embraces grief, growth, and grace all together. How? Lotus emerges from the muddy waters, which represents grief, say, for example, here in a metaphorical interpretation. And then the green petal on it sits, it never detaches itself from the muddy base. In fact, it is in the muddy base that the lotus is growing its roots. Eventually, lotus opens itself up to the universe, to the expansive skies. So that's the connection with the higher purpose. So lotus symbolizes all 3 together. So ring of lotus, I feel that it's no wonder it is called ring of lotus, because ring of lotus is where we start to prepare ourselves for movement towards the self with a capital S, which sits at the center, at the nucleus of a mandala, the awakened, the enlightened, the knowing self. So these with these things, combining mandala consciousness, lotus symbolism, and of course post-traumatic growth and growth wisdom, putting all of these together, Viktor Frankl's logotherapeutic therapeutic meaning of life, all these things putting together with constructivist psychology and social constructionism, I created this model called GROWTH Mandala. And of course, it is backed by my professional experience, my personal lived experience, and all that I have learned from so many experts and my mentors. This is how it is pictorially presented. The outer ring, the ring of fire, is where we get to affirm our grief. And why I use the term affirm and not acceptance? Because affirm is, to me, is a broader spectrum where we begin by not noticing, by acknowledging, by allowing it to sit with us. It's not just some cognitive acceptance in the head, but it is something living with the experience and allowing it to manifest in its fullness, and then saying that, yes, I say yes to you. So grief affirmation happens at the circumference or the threshold between the self, that is the manifest self, and the manifest world, because we need help from the world. We are living with the world. We are addressing our pain in the world. So we create our constructs while living with the world. Our grief is never totally personal, though it is personal, but it is also relational. In fact, that reminds me of a beautiful quotation by Greek psychologist William Worden, who adopted Gordon Allport's famous quote about personality. Gordon Allport once said that everybody is like everybody else, everybody is like somebody else, and everybody is like nobody else. So this is about the universality and the individuality of human personality. Grief psychologist William Worden adopted it to grief context and said everybody's grief is like everybody else's grief. Everybody's grief is like somebody else's grief. And everybody's grief is like nobody else's grief. So the outer two rings, ring of fire and ring of Vajra or thunderbolt, are the two circles where we are still working with our grief. Working is the wrong word, I'm sorry, I withdraw it. But living with our grief, affirming our grief, adapting to it while transacting our life with the world. So everybody's grief is like everybody else's grief, and everybody's grief is like somebody else's grief, are the two truths that guide our grief resolution or grief affirmation while we are in the outer two rings. And then as we slowly move more inwards, it becomes more and more of a personal journey, more and more of a unique journey, more and more of a very, very subjective journey, individual journey. So that's where it becomes like everybody's grief is like nobody else's grief. These are the rings of transformation and harmonious reemergence. Now, what are the two triangles on the sides? The two triangles are the triangles of active consciousness, active pursuance of restoration, of adaptation. So in this, we open up to the emergent world, the world which has changed in the aftermath of loss, the world which has changed with our grief having hit us. So we open to that world and we create our new narratives. We construct our new narrative for life, for our own identity, for our relationship with the deceased loved one, and with our relationship with the remaining people in our life. Because sometimes what happens is that the deceased loved one was perhaps the anchor point or the bridge point for the remaining members of the family. And then with the deceased loved one gone, the other members of the family have to reconstruct their relationships, have to reconfigure our relationships. My younger son, who's in the room right now, for him, my elder son was perhaps the number one person in his life. For him, he was perhaps a greater parent figure than I or my husband were for him. So when my elder son transcended this modern world, for my younger son, he had to reconfigure everything for himself in the relationship realm. And it was not easy. It was a very, very traumatic journey. So opening to the emergent is where we see that now who we are in the aftermath of this loss. Who have we lost and who have we become and who we are in the aftermath of loss. So we open up to the emergent and we create new narratives. Then other triangle is the triangle of well-being, where well-being at various levels, at physiological level, in fact, body gets hit very badly in the aftermath of loss and trauma and grief, but we often tend to ignore it. We do not even notice that body needs some attention. We tend to pay perhaps more attention to our emotional turmoil, which is important, no doubt. But at the same time, body also is hit very badly. So at various levels, we have to reconstruct our well-being. So physiological, mental, spiritual, relational, emotional, so many levels. So way to well-being is another triangle of restoration. Eventually, we return to the world, but when we return to the world, we are no longer returning to the world for ourselves. When we reach that stage of deep, meaningful reemergence in life, it is often with a calling, it is often with a higher purpose, with a greater call that we return to the world. And that return to the world, therefore, is something that I call self-transcendent. There's so many people I have worked with who have eventually transformed their pain into purpose and taken up a legacy mission in the remembrance of their deceased loved one. And they have dedicated their lives to serving a particular cause in the remembrance of their deceased loved one, or created a new legacy mission altogether. And in that sense, I think of the word remembrance as remembering something that has got dismembered. And what is got dismembered is not just our life in the aftermath of loss, but also our identities, because sometimes our identities are so closely fused with our deceased loved one that once they are gone, our whole identity is kind of, fallen apart. So that dismembered identity, or that dismembered reality of life, is something we begin to remember. And that remember is eventually in that remembrance is something that is best served through some legacy mission. So that is what I call self-transcendent return to the world. And this is whoever gets to pick the book would perhaps read this. The book has many tiny poetries from me, and I think that's another legacy inheritance I've got from my son, who's a great poet. From his early childhood, he was, we used to call him the bard of the family. And I think somewhere maybe his poetic voice was getting channeled through me. So you will find tiny poetries also inside the book. And in fact, each chapter is ending with a poetic affirmation, where I create an affirmation, putting together all the learnings of that chapter. And then I offer a tiny prompt to the reader to create their own poetic affirmation. And this is over and above the exercises which are there in the book. There are several exercises which are therapeutic writing, therapeutic arts, and transformative tips and things like that. So this is all about the book. And finally, this I've already told you, the third part. This is where I would end, and then let's open it over to everyone. Though this
Neena,
quotation comes early on, yes.
If you want
Shall
to
I
go back
stop?
just one slide, because someone was asking about that acronym again, the GRACE. Yeah, maybe we can just keep that up for the
This
GRACE
one?
one. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Someone was asking about that.
So when I have written, basically it is like in the book, it is mentioned as affirmation, gratitude, reverence for life, affirmation, compassion, and essence of life. For me personally, the hardest chapter to write was the chapter of forgiveness, because I realized that unless I embody that myself, perhaps I can't write about forgiveness. So I actually went about seeking forgiveness and offering forgiveness, not necessarily related to my loss or grief, but of all the things in life which I thought, which the wrongs that I had done to others, or the wrongs which had been done to me, a very deep, humbling and somber experience of experiencing forgiveness, offering it and seeking it, and of course forgiving myself also. This was a very hard chapter for me to write. Shall I move on?
Yes, do you want to open it up for questions?
Yes. I just wanted to close it with this, though this quotation comes early in the book, but I thought that this is a very appropriate closure for today's conversation. And I stop the share and then, sorry, yeah.
I will start then. I'm Sheila Aitken, and I'm the managing editor of AI Practitioner, and worked with Neena on the issue of grief and growth, which was a very deep experience and very meaningful. And I think universal in that I've certainly had stages and places in my life where I've experienced deep grief. And so the process is known. It's not comfortable, but it certainly is known. But what I wanted to say today is that I really appreciate the way Neena has linked, has united her personal story with the professional journey that she's been on, and seen how they're not even just connected, they're interwoven, that I think perhaps, Neena, one wouldn't have happened without the other.
Thank you, Sheila, for this acknowledgement. This really means a lot. Thank you.
Hello. And I would like to say too, as one who's worked with grief and trauma, I really appreciate a book in which the person's own journey becomes that which the person can connect with and see how it's been used. And it sure sounds like you've done a wonderful job.
Thank you so much, Brian, for this, for your affirmative words. Very gracious of you to say this. And just to add to that, you know, each chapter is actually beginning with a real story. So each chapter starts with a real story, but except for chapter 9, everywhere else, we have altered the identity to respect the desire for confidentiality and privacy of the protagonist, except the last chapter, which is the only non-human story. So it's not just my story alone, but also, you know, stories of very real people, their real stories, combining these together and then making the point of a particular chapter.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm not totally grasping the point you made about grief and growth together. Can you help me? What is it that you're trying to hold up about the together piece?
Okay. Thank you for asking this very important question. Many people ask this. And so a common perception about grief is that at some point it can be resolved fully and there'll be some closure. Whereas it is not necessarily true in many cases. In fact, in most cases, grief would not have a closure. Why it would not have a closure is simply because grief is a cry of love. So if love is there, grief would also be there. But if grief is there, it does not mean that grief banishes out post-traumatic growth. It allows enough space for growth also to happen. And when we say growth, it is about, you know, greater appreciation for life, greater spirit of servicefulness, a higher meaning and purpose in life, enhanced relationships. We start to value other relationships. We start to value life. So all those are also growth markers. They happen while grief is still there. Grief is still there. But of course, with time, its intensity, its severity is slowly fading away. But while grief is there, it does not banish out growth. And growth does not demand that first grief be done with and then only I will start. So both can coexist and both do coexist. And that's why I call the three, grief, growth, grace, existential co-pilgrims. That they are not anti each other. In fact, in some way, they are having a paradoxical dance together. Have I answered your question?
Yes, I think that helped pull it together. That makes sense to me, and also my experience.
Thank you so much.
I've got a question.
Hello, Emma.
Hello, thank you,
Hello
Neena.
to your daughter. Hello to your daughter as well.
She's there, Alice. My question is about, actually, it's about togetherness, I suppose, as well, because when you're, for example, a couple and there's grief, there's a death, there's two different journeys happening, and my curiosity is around the accompanying well, each is on their own journey. Does your book have any wisdom to share on the togetherness of those two journeys?
Please help me understand you with clarity. Are you meaning that there are two people who are living together and who are both on grief journey?
Yeah, so you could be parents of the child, or it could be parents of a sibling, or I mean a couple and a sibling of one of them, you know.
This is a very important theme that we all should address. In this book, I have touched upon it at some places, but I have not really gone into the depth in which I would have, I would have loved to go. Incidentally, day after tomorrow, when this book marks the first anniversary, on that day, I'm talking in an Indian forum on specifically the theme that you are talking of, which is companioning for grief. So even in the shared loss, like you talked about, the loss of a child, the two partners may be grieving totally differently and completely disconnected and de-linked with each other. I'm telling you from my experience, my husband's way of grieving and my way of grieving. He doesn't understand me, and I struggle to reach out to him. So how do we, in such a circumstance, how do we continue to be together, continue to hold space for each other, and continue to companion each other for each other's grief, each other's way, not my way? That's a very, very important topic to talk about. This book does touch this here and there, but not in the depth in which I want to touch it in a book exclusively dedicated to this. If you're interested, I'll be happy to send you the link for the talk which I'm giving day after tomorrow on this theme called Companioning for Grief. And it is at 9 a.m. EST.
Thank you.
I'll be happy to share this with Alex, and maybe Alex can pass it on to you.
Yes, sure.
Thank you, Neena. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like that link. There is something that is Dr. Voss has claimed ambiguous loss. I particularly work with people with dementia. And so that is similar to what Emma was asking about. Here are two people who are on this journey together. And do you have much that you can talk about that kind of grief loss?
So in companioning for grief, I'm giving it a little broader touch in that talk, which will include about ambiguous loss, about two people who are in the shared loss but totally disconnected from each other. So all kinds of companioning, professional companioning also, as the helping professionals. So so it's a broader spectrum on which I talk. But I completely get your point, Brian, that ambiguous loss is one space where somebody can feel totally lost and lonely. And even though one is surrounded by relatives and friends and other people, one may be totally feeling abandoned and lonely and left alone. I get your point. In a future book, I want to dedicate exclusively to this theme, which is companioning for grief.
David, you have your hand up?
Yeah, if I understand Dr. Neena here, is that one may move between grief and acceptance. I'm thinking of a terminally ill person like cancer, and gets a shock that, yes, I'm no longer going to live like before, I'm about to die. And therefore, over a certain time, this person, when he thinks about the problem, there's a grief, but some way he may accept that, well, this is new me. And will that be part of growth, as I understand Dr. Neena saying?
Yes, of course, it would be part of growth. It would be part of perhaps grace also, because, I somewhere say an affirmative yes to the call of destiny, because this person, as you said, has finally realized that he's in a terminal condition and he might be going very soon. So this could be part of grace as well. But at the same time, I want to underline one thing, that acceptance is not a stage in finality. If you remember in the eternal spiral, it sits at the confluence. Even when one has reached acceptance, it is very much possible that back and forth, I may jump back into the stage of shock and despair and anguish and fight with my reality.
No,
So
I agree.
So grief and growth, therefore, that's why they sit in a loop. It's very much possible that having reached the growth side, I may still keep finding myself, pushed back into despair. But since it is a loop, I have a way of finding my way back into that. So what you said, this realization, of course, it is in the growth space, but it can regress back to trauma.
Thanks, Doctor.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Greg, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you very much. My apologies for not having my camera on right now. But I just want to say, Dr. Neena, at so many levels, thank you so much for your vulnerability, for bringing your personal story and sense of self and culture into the presentation in the book. So appreciate it. And my comment is, I appreciate also the dynamic perspective, non-Western perspective you share with us as a gift, understanding that it is not a linear process of grief and grace and growth. And as a Black man, I just find it sometimes it's very difficult when there is an imposition of culture. And so your perspective in helping us to see how things change, and it's not just one experience, is a gift. And so I just want to say thank you. And I'm hoping that in reading the book, the idea of grace and forgiveness can be one in a time of multiple pandemics, in a time of great suffering, that we can find this kind of growth and resiliency. And so I so appreciate your dedication and love and vulnerability to share that this was not an easy book, nor is it one that we should take lightly. And so thank you for your gift.
Thank you so much for saying this. And when you were saying, I just got reminded of the fact that I think I lived this book in a sense that just when I completed the first draft of the manuscript and submitted it to the publisher, soon thereafter, I had a critical encounter with COVID. I nearly died in the second Delta wave of 2002 in summer. 2 months almost with critical COVID, 1.5 months in ICU, followed by 6 months of long COVID. And the book got launched while I was still in long COVID. And now I have gifts of the dear friend Corona left with me that I would be living with for the rest of my life. So they're post-COVID complications. And so when I say grief and growth happen together, in that experience of my life, I realized that I was living and dying together. When my lung had gone totally non-responsive, when the doctors had clearly told my husband it's a matter of minutes or it's a matter of hours, we don't know. When the lung was refusing to breathe and I was on ventilation, my mind remembered to breathe. My heart remembered to breathe. And I think somewhere, the whole experience of writing this book was also coming alive for me. After I came out of it and returned to home, and then the copy editing work started, and then the invocation chapter was the only one which I wrote later. And in that, I wrote these lines, if I have Alex's permission to very quickly read just 5 lines from that, where I say that it took longer than expected to complete this book, and not without reason. Each aspect and concept touched a chord within and helped me grow beyond myself. Each phase of the growth mandala and grace pilgrimage that I take you through first took me through myself. Another pain embraced, another joy surfaced, another cry aloud, another celebration avowed, another wound healed, another wisdom revealed, another me discovered, all anew. So this is another tiny story I wanted to share.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
David, I see you have your hands up. Maybe one last comment?
Yes, yes. I just want to ask Dr. Neena now.
Please call me Neena. Please call me Neena.
Oh, Neena, when in front of the client now, listening to the experience and let me say while consulting, I mean, what part of your model would you start? Where would you place your model where you'd be able to externalize and deconstruct, and as you say, reauthoring the story again? Yes. Where would you place your model? I mean, if I'm to move around while listening for the experience and I externalize, okay, deconstruct, how would you maneuver using your model?
I don't know whether I would be offering you an answer that would satisfy you. My guess is I might disappoint you with my answer, but the truth, my truth is that my model and all other things that I have learned in grief psychology, other than that, compassion focused therapy, logotherapy, appreciative inquiry, constructivist psychology, everything informs my preparation.
Oh, yes.
But what happens in the here and now space of work with the client is guided by where the client is and what the client needs.
Yes.
At that stage, it is not that I personally think that the client perhaps needs to be in the phase of resilient adaptation. No, it is where the client is. I go and meet the client where they are, like you must also be doing. So all this informs my preparation, but not my performance in my client work. Here and now, the emergent space and the emergent developments in the client space and client work inform our responses and our interventions and our maneuverings and our work and our dance with the client.
Now, I do understand, because we don't diagnose, we don't prescribe, but we really listen to the client and move along with what the client tells us. Yes, thanks.
But one thing I for sure in Growth Mandala, I try to sense when I feel that now the client work is perhaps aligned to and more ready for the Growth Mandala work to come in, I do try to sense where they are. Are they in the outer ring of fire where they are still sitting on the threshold with the samsara, with the manifest world? Where are they? Because if they are still there, if they are more out there than in here, then perhaps they need a greater ecosystem of support in their life. Yes. So I help them find their own anchors outside of themselves, their scaffolds outside of themselves. And if I sense that their journey more inward journey has started, they are shifting towards inner rings, which is the ring of thunderbolt or the ring of lotus. So that's where, a deeper work within oneself, perhaps, is what I would, facilitate them for. So my job is to sense where they are and then design the work around them.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And I just want to thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Neena, so much for sharing your wisdom and your time with us today. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day or night, wherever you are. So thank you.